Shabbat Shalom, and welcome again to newcomers at CBST. We're so happy that you're here from the village to Queens to Frankfurt and Berlin and Paris, and even I hear the Upper West Side. Though I'm detecting some Bostonians in the house, which is really exciting. What a fun surprise. This is a curious evening on the Jewish calendar, a queer evening, if you will. We find ourselves on the tail end of the 33rd day of the Omer, Lag BaOmer, a scholars' holiday and a field day, with effigies and bonfires, with weddings and mystical experiences. That was a list of 6. How many of you have done at least one of those things today? How many for effigies? Weddings? I'm counting on all of you to have had some sort of mystical experience today. And we find ourselves entering the Shabbat of Parshat Emor, filled with priests and skin gashes. They're not supposed to really meet. Extreme punishments, infidelity edition, if you will. Bodily defects aplenty. Biblical holidays and extreme punishments, blasphemy edition. There's enough here for, I think, several reality television shows in this awesome, awesome Parsha of Emor. This week has not only been a horrendous one in the ongoing violence for Israelis and for Palestinians, but it's also been a bit of a kind of week for President Trump's visit to the Middle East. Thank God, Idan Alexander is no longer in captivity. Yet, Israel has cut short the lives of hundreds more human beings this week in Gaza. In reaction to Trump's Middle East tour, I've noticed, you may have noticed or chosen not to notice, that the internet is abuzz with things like, this or that decision sounds pretty awful, or this or that decision sounds like it could have been worse. Often rebuffed with, just in case you're not paying attention to a small gift of a large airplane, or my friend's incredible culture, this is what a corrupt government looks like. Some weeks ago, Cooper Bear Gritmaster rabbinical intern Marcus Hawley took an informal survey of the Kabbalat Shabbat crowd here at CBST from this bima. And while I would hate to say this was what you would call a precise scientific study, the anecdotal evidence revealed that more CBST congregants prefer the biblical book of Esther to the biblical book of Leviticus. Some of you might have noticed that a week or two later, I started handing you out copies of my colleague Maurice Harris's book, Leviticus. You have no idea. In an attempt to rehabilitate the image of a middle Sefer syndrome, because you were on the receiving end of a couple of dozen of these books that I gave out and continue to recommend. I do not receive any royalties on this book. He might have thanked me somewhere. I don't remember. One thing we know about the priestly authors of Vayikra, of Leviticus, is they loved categorizing, which often means they loved binaries. Biblical scholars teach us that these are the same authors who wrote the beginning of the Torah. Not only does God create a world with words, let there be light, but God categorizes things into neat little packages. Well, I guess neat big packages. Light and dark. Liquid water and water vapor. Dry land and seas. Likewise, in this week's Parsha, there are distinctions made between holy and secular, pure and defiled, and the opening of the Parsha sets aside the priests, the Kohanim, in a category of their own. Strict rules of marriage, strict boundaries around mourning. It seems to become very, very hard, as one B mitzvah student observed to me. It seems to be very hard if you are born into the family of priests, not to go into the family business. Interestingly, this language of defect, describing the one doing the sacrifice, or ineligible to do the sacrifice, is also used to describe the object of the sacrifice. Not only must the priests themselves be free of these defects, but the animal being sacrificed must be free of defects as well. This is a hard passage to grapple with. On its surface, it seems quite ableist. Not one of the offspring of Aaron, the high priest, with a physical defect shall approach to sacrifice bread of their God, the text teaches us. In fact, many of our classical commentators dwelled on these physical imperfections 1,000 plus years after the last Jewish animal sacrifice was made on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And perhaps in its time, the text was accepted with its pshat, with the plainest meaning, not focusing so much on even, can I approach the altar with a disability, but rather like the elementary school teacher who reminds us that we're not supposed to say, can I go to the bathroom? Because of course, maybe, you can. We're supposed to say, may I? May I use the restroom? May I approach God? Even though I have a sense of whether or not I can. And the person who may be disabled in all sorts of ways, a broken limb, a growth in their eye, crushed testes, says the text, cannot approach the altar. The irony, of course, is once the priestly author of the Tanakh, of the Torah, starts creating categories of imperfections, everyone is bound to have something wrong with us. I mean, that is part of what makes us human. When any of us is focused less on what's going on when any of us is focused less on ourselves and the full complexity of our own humanity, we might catch ourselves looking at others, making judgments about others, falling into that very human behavior that seems to come very naturally, but should often be fought against, of putting people into categories. It has been said that when somebody who might describe themselves as able-bodied or not developmentally disabled is asked about their disability status, perhaps the best answer is, I am not disabled yet, because anything can happen to anyone at any time, and the prayer Hashkivenu that we sang earlier is a reminder of that kind of fragility. It's not to say that we should all live our lives in a way waiting for that thing or something to happen, but a recognition of each of our humanity and the diversity of each of our abilities and disabilities is important. My teacher, Rabbi Louis Aaron, has taught that there's this special blessing that the Talmud gives us when we find ourselves not so focused on ourselves and our own uniqueness, but instead catch ourselves staring at someone else. You sometimes find this blessing in the prayer book, and it says something like, upon seeing exceptionally strange-looking human beings, you might say, Baruch Mishaneh Habriyot, blessed is God who makes the creatures different. Sounds a little bit like a Midwest euphemism, having lived in Minneapolis for 5 years. But Rabbi Aaron, for me, I think really concretized this by saying, when you catch yourself staring, this is the blessing we say. Because each of us is different. That includes me. That includes the person who might be trying to categorize, making a judgment. And that in itself is already a blessing. Each of us is made in God's image, and each of us is different. The human inclination to categorize things might begin at the very beginning of the Torah. I just told you about the priestly author categorizing things in the creation of the world. And yet there is a second biblical story there where water and the earth and humanity and the vegetation that we come to eat are all commingled as the Garden of Eden comes together. But that's not all. Even in the 7 days of creation, with all of those divisions and those various binaries, there is an interconnectedness here and there among creation that might otherwise seem separate. I think the strongest example of this is this notion that humanity, that primeval humanity, that Adam HaKadmon, is created in one individual. And we have this notion that since each of us is a descendant of this one primeval Adam, this one primeval earthling, that no one's great-great-grandparent is better than the next person's great-great-grandparent, that each of us has a tiny piece of that primeval humanity within us. Each of us is part of that Adam HaKadmon. And our sages even picked up on this during writing Midrashim on the creation story, when they understood that God creating us as male and female might have meant that Adam HaKadmon had both masculinity and femininity, whatever that means, in one giant earthling. And when the Talmud is written down, our sages recognized that what we might call sex or gender today, either of them, is not a binary. People are born with all sorts of bodies. They grow and change in all sorts of ways, some of which might be explainable and some of which are mysterious. And all of this, each one of these experiences, is part of Adam, part of humanity, part of the totality of us from that primeval earthling until this very moment of, 8 billion plus people on this planet. And it's pretty awesome when genetics corroborates the broad diversity of human gender while simultaneously revealing that human beings have much more in common with each other than we do not. I had a birthday this week, and one thing that we do in our family is we're always doing kind of the math ahead. So that means when you turn 14, you are welcomed to the first day of your 15th year, right? You've completed 14 years, and now, okay, you got the idea. So sometimes we joke that this makes us feel older than we are, and sometimes we don't joke and, have the moments of thinking, oh my gosh, how old am I? How did this happen? One of my favorite people who studies aging is named Bill Thomas. He's a gerontologist and has blogged at Changing Aging, and a great book that he wrote is called What Are Old People For? And Dr. Thomas delves into this notion of elderhood that we sometimes forget is actually a developmental phase that sometimes we just push together into adulthood and assume that people go through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, and as Dr. Thomas has said, the more you can trade stocks on the internet and, what was his quote? I think, go surfing naked at the age of 95, the more successful you are. Whereas in reality, anytime Dr. Thomas taught, anytime someone, let's say, who's 20 is acting as if they were 8, we might say that person is a bit delayed, right? Like in their ongoing development. And so it's really the exception and not the rule when people go through further and further phases of elderhood and are somehow can do all these things that they might have done 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years earlier. I think this is a beautiful thing, to recognize elderhood as its own phase that comes with certain developmental needs, that comes with thinking about leaving legacies. In fact, tonight our Ner Tamid Society was meeting before services and has a program after services, and part of what it means to grow and to change and think about the world we want to be in and leave behind us, even if it's in years and years away, is to think about legacies. On Wednesday morning, I left the house to meet my mom on my 50th birthday. And I am so privileged that my parents are not only here in this world, here in this city, and coincidentally, they were living just a few blocks from here and a few blocks from where I grew up at the time I was born. So I had the awesome privilege of spending a couple of hours with my family, specifically starting with my mom, and hearing kind of the narrative of the rainy May 13th, in which she went into labor at the corner of 34th Street and Lexington Avenue. And not on the sidewalk, in the apartment, but she did spend most of the day having eaten a lot of Celeste pizzas that were on sale from the store down below, which really feel like I learned a lot about myself based on this. Sort of junk food propensity type thing. And also spent the day amidst the contractions baking peanut butter chocolate chip cookies, which at that point she could not eat because of the labor. But as they went to NYU Hospital, we took this walk together on Wednesday. This was fed to about 3 different shifts of staff in the hospital until I was born the following morning. It was awesome. And it was also an opportunity filled with awareness of ability and disability. Some of you are aware that my mom had broken her leg last summer and thankfully has gotten to a better place. But that also doesn't mean that everyone's walking exactly like they would have 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years ago either. And I'm aware of that as well. Pirkei Avot teaches that when you're 5 years old, you're ready to study Torah. And at 10, the Mishnah, 13, you're ready for the commandments. 15, study Torah. It goes on. At 40, you're at the age of wisdom. And at 50, you are able to give counsel. So I wanted to boldly try to give a little counsel to wrap up tonight. Wednesday, morning, afternoon, and evening. On my way to meet my mom, a person emerged from the subway. The rain started to come down much harder than I expected it to. I was not carrying an umbrella. And this person who I'd never met before handed me an umbrella and said, "Here, it's broken, but if you hold it like this, it will work really well." And he was right, and I did, and it survived the day, and I stayed much drier than I think I would have otherwise. Afternoon. I was walking down the street, West 23rd Street, toward the river, Hudson River, and I hear in front of me someone say, "Oh, I love you!" I was like, that's not for me, right? It was kind of going that way. And my attention was caught, and I turned, and who did I see on the street? But Devin Rodriguez, who you might know as a 29-year-old portrait artist from the Bronx, from the South Bronx, who has brought joy to so many people of all sorts of shapes and sizes, abilities and disabilities, genders and colors, when he has walked up to people in the street and said things like, "Wow, I love your style. Can you sit with me?" And a little while later, so it seems on the internet, there's this beautiful picture of the person when they've told their story. If you haven't seen his stuff, it's really something. So I turned, and in fact, I saw Devin right there, and was a little starstruck, and said something like, "I just want to echo what she said," and then continued to walk. Evening. I had this opportunity to attend this beautiful, beautiful benefit for an awesome organization. And part of the benefit was a live auction by none other than the person described by Wikipedia as the world's leading charity auctioneer, Lydia Finnett. And after the 6 items had been auctioned, she wanted to raise a few $100,000 from the group and having us raise our paddles at different levels. And when we got to the $25,000 level, she said, "All you have to do is give $1 a day for the next 25,000 days." And our table was like in stitches. We couldn't stop laughing. But it also, when I did the math and figured out, you could do that within 68 and a half years, no problem, that those 68 and a half years would really take any person, the 1-year-old who raised their paddle, or the 60-year-old who raised their paddle, through ages and stages, and $1 a day, and $1 a day, and $1 a day, right? We're in this time now of the Omer, of counting day after day after day, linking Pesach to Shavuot, this idea that we count up, that we have this awareness day after day. Imagine having the kind of awareness to count up to 25,000 day after day after day. Not just belly laughing from Lydia's amazing presentation of this, and there was, I do want to clarify, a person who said we will give 25,000, which was awesome. But how can we treasure each day? How can we treasure who we are and what we have at any moment? Not take what we have and who we are for granted? And at the same time, recognize that so much could be fleeting. The Psalms tell us, the 90th Psalm, right? Limnot yamenu kein hoda. Yitz's husband Henkin translates this as, teach us to treasure each day that we may open our eyes to your wisdom. In the 90s, a movie came out called Wide Life, and it reflected on people who were dying very young from HIV/AIDS. And the whole title of the movie was based on a Mexican proverb, I was told, though I've not yet been able to locate it all these years later, that it is not the length of our days, but rather their width that is important. So whether it is $1 a day for 25,000 days, or just starting by counting the next day of the Omer tonight, let us treasure each day. Let us treasure who we are and what we have, what we don't have. Let us treasure the people near us, and when we catch ourselves staring, let us recognize that opportunity to learn is also a blessing. Please join me back in our Sidurim as we count the Omer. We're going to rise as we turn to page 228. We'll recite the blessing and then